All right. So we should be getting going in about 30 seconds here, about a minute, 30 seconds. My name is Pulkit, just letting people get into the room. That way, we can get this going. All right, cool. So I'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Pulkit Agrawal, and I am the founder and CEO of The Fifth Ingredient. And today's topic is going to be about this aspect that all of us have, which is you're capturing all this brewery data. Now what? And in particular, we're going to be focusing a lot on the entire traceability side of things. And so just before we get started, I want to give a huge thank you to Andrew Copeland for setting this all up and everything that's happening in the Craft Brew Professionals group. He has become a huge advocate for the community, and it's been great to see him, leading the effort for all these conferences and everything else that's happening. So thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the community. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to go through an introduction so people know who I am. We're then going to go into the importance of data management. The next focus is going to be on traceability feedback loop. And so this is the key aspect of today's talk, which is understanding the way that you can actually utilize the data to go step by step in 4 key aspects. One is brew planning, which is scheduling and task management. Then we get into step 2 of the feedback loop, which is brewing to warehouse, looking at raw materials and yeast. From there, step 3 is understanding cost of goods sold, so COGS, and understanding how that ties in with lot traceability and packaging costs and batch costs overall. From there, we're now looking at understanding further about distribution and sales traceability. And then we'll even have like a bonus aspect of the feedback loop, which goes into what happens if there is a product recall. So really cool aspects of looking at traceability and feedback loops. And finally, we'll talk about some key takeaways that tie in with this important aspect of data management. So let's get started with that. First off, looking at the introduction. So again, my name is Pulkit Agrawal, founder and CEO. Our company, The Fifth Ingredient, has also launched that famous software that you keep hearing about called Beer 30. And it's basically a software that breweries use to track their data from grain to glass, start to finish, and have real-time data validation that's happening. The goal is to really focus on eliminating paper logs, spreadsheets, whiteboards, and have this all-in-one system that can help you track your data. Just as a background, I actually studied mechanical engineering at Harvard University and then worked for Ballast Point Brewing here in San Diego, California for a couple of years as a process engineer, focusing mainly on the packaging equipment, and launched their entire nitrogen beer brand on the bottling side as well. So, have a lot of background when it comes to packaging lines and just in general when it comes to the brewery side of things that tie in together with Beer 30. So what exactly is the fifth ingredient? So the 4 ingredients in beer: water, malt, hops, yeast, and the 5th ingredient is data. And so everything here really ties in with how data is used to help a brewery actually get better and actually help utilize all the different aspects associated with it. From there, a little bit about Beer 30, where Beer 30 is designed to go grain to glass tracking. So everything from scheduled task management, raw materials, yeast, process side, all the way down into sales and distribution, and even accounting integration with Xero and QuickBooks Online. And what's really interesting is that over the last 3 years of working on the software, what's really come about is really understanding for a brewery what is the importance of data management. And I think the key that I really want to emphasize here is that we are all trained to capture data and notes on paper, spreadsheets, whiteboards, right? This is something that happens going back to like elementary and middle school, right? Which is, let's take data and let's start, recording this information. But realistically, when we think about it, a lot of us just keep that data in binders and spreadsheets, and it's just sitting on a shelf somewhere. But it's actually that data that helps give feedback from this data, which drives business decisions, right? And so that's where data management becomes super important because it impacts daily operations. And realistically, there's 2 types of data management. There's good data management, where everything is fast and clear and you're able to make decisions and you're very proactive with how things are actually happening at your brewery. And then there's realistically poor data management, which is when it's a bit more time consuming, it's difficult, it can get very repetitive and redundant, and that becomes that second aspect of things, right? And the importance behind data management is understanding that it's a twofold equation, that it's about the power of the data, but as well as the flexibility that really ties in with understanding how all these pieces fit in together. And so that's where this importance of data management really comes in. So with that, let's actually dive into the overall traceability feedback loop that we're looking at. And like I mentioned, there's 4 steps, and there's technically a bonus as well. And we'll dive into each of those one at a time now. So looking back at this flow diagram that we have of all the different aspects of a brewery, we're really going to focus in on scheduling and tasks, looking at raw materials and yeast management, jumping into the traceability side of packaging material, batch costing, understanding distribution and sales, and then tying that up with batch history. And the really awesome thing about this is that when you take these different areas that I'm pointing out, it turns into this really cool diagram, nice and clean, which starts off with this aspect of understanding the starting side, going into scheduling and tasks, raw materials and yeast management, again, understanding the cost of goods and costing side, distribution and sales, and batch history. And the beauty behind this feedback loop is that this is agnostic of any particular software that you may have, any particular data process they're using, whether it is paper logs, spreadsheets, whiteboards, whether it is a brewing software system like Beer 30 or a different one. This is the similarity that is in all of beer production, which is this traceability aspect and going from start to finish. So what we'll do is we'll start off first by looking at step 1, which is brew planning. And with that, this really dives in with understanding what's happening with the actual brew schedule side of things. So this is a really cool flow diagram and Gantt chart, which shows exactly what's happening in each tank, actions that are happening with brewing, with fermenting, dry hopping, etc. And the key aspects that a lot of people should consider when it comes to this brew scheduling side is tank utilization, understanding what's happening with availability of materials, raw materials, and packaging supplies, and incorporating that together. From there, understanding work schedules, right? Understanding which brewers are on leave, who's actually coming in, whether it's a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday, and just understanding how all of that ties in with the overall plan that's happening at the brewery, right? And the key with having something that's digitized is that even if you're not coming in, you could be, and you're the head brewer or somebody in charge or manager, you can legitimately make adjustments on the fly without having to say, hey, can you please go in and erase that whiteboard associated with things. From there, looking at equipment availability, right? And understanding what's happening with the packaging lines that are available or centrifuges, and really diving in with understanding from the base of tanks all the way up to the end result of where the product's going to go. From there, understanding uncooperative yeast, right? What's your backup plan should it be that yeast starts stalling, right? And so understanding that and adding that in as part of the scheduling side. And then from there, even taking it a full step forward and looking at things like product demand, current burn rate, and really forecasting where things are going to go. And this is going to be great. And this is why I love this talk, because that last aspect of demand and current burn rate is going to tie right back into that loop that we're talking about. And that's what makes this entire talk and just this aspect of data utilization super powerful with things. So with that, step 2 is looking at the brew to warehouse side. So in particular, the aspects that I want to focus on now are raw materials and yeast, right? And raw materials, as we know, include grain, hops, adjuncts, and then also the yeast side of things, right? And so with that, when you actually start breaking things down, let's take a first look at raw materials. Now, this is again a screenshot from Beer 30, and the key things that I want to emphasize in general with raw material inventory is understanding what the real-time availability is. And this really dives in with understanding what's available to brew, and more importantly, getting warnings if ingredients dip below certain thresholds, right? And so here you can see that there's 8,000 pounds as my low quantity notice, and once I hit that 7,046 mark, as soon as I go below, it flags it as red, right? And this really helps you understand when it comes to planning, hey, do I really have that ingredient available or not? From there, what's also awesome about raw materials is to be able to look at usage history and understand on what day you use a particular lot, what day you use a particular ingredient, and then what brew it went, right? So again, tying in with the traceability, and a really cool bonus that happens if you do this correctly, whether it's in a spreadsheet or a software, is that you should be able to, at a snap of a fingers, understand the on-hand dollar value for grains, hops, and adjuncts, right? And this becomes super awesome and super powerful when you're looking at your balance sheet, when you're looking at aspects of understanding just what's happening at the brewery and really diving those in to understand the true dollar value of just inventory that's sitting around. From there, let's look at lot numbers. Now, when you start zooming in further, you realize that lot numbers become the crucial aspect when it comes to traceability. So in this case, understanding the lot numbers that are coming from vendors, and importantly, you can tie those up with certificate of analyses, tie that up further with landed costs. So if you're looking at, for example, this screenshot that I have here, based on different POs that happened on the days that the lots came in, it could be 57 cents per pound versus 59 cents, 59.53 cents per pound, right? And this becomes important because maybe you did have to overnight grain, right? And because you had to overnight grain or you had to overnight hops or something, the landed cost can be so much more than what the normal cost is. And if you assume average cost, or if you assume first in, first out, that really doesn't tell you the true cost of what's happening with a particular beer, right? And that's really where the whole traceability flow and loop comes in. And so with this, there's a power to track ingredients by lots, but also the flexibility to operate without it. And so this is a unique feature that we really believe in Beer 30, which is to allow this not tracked bucket per brew. And so what you can see here is that with this not tracked aspect, I can actually keep brewing. And in this case, it's telling me that there's about 774 pounds worth of grain, which hasn't been allocated to a lot during the brew day. Right, and this becomes super powerful because you never want to feel like whatever system you're using that you're quote unquote locked out of brewing just because somebody hasn't entered in a lot number or somebody hasn't done a stock take, right? Keep brewing, put it into this not tracked bucket, allowing you the flexibility to go in after the fact and add in those different lot numbers and associate those costs. If anybody has any questions as I'm talking about this, feel free to comment, add them in, and we'll go from there on things as well. From there, let's talk about the actual brew day. Now, this becomes super awesome, and you can see here, like in terms of the brew log, that on the brew day, you really want to remember to select the multiple lots as ingredients because they all need to be tracked backwards with the lot numbers and dollar values. And this is one of my favorite things about the brew log and the way it's designed in Beer 30, which is you're able to come in, understand that, hey, you know, I have 1,200 pounds of churro that's being used. Of that, 200 pounds is a $1.54 one, and the remaining is coming in from this 39-cent lot from ATP Group, right? And so this becomes a really interesting way to start diving in and understanding just what's happening with real-time inventory depletions. Because one of the worst things that we hear in frustration points is you make an adjustment, you make a brew log depletion, then you need to go and copy that brew log data into your overall inventory, and this loop just becomes very archaic and almost like homework, right? And becomes this like repetitive aspect that none of us really want to deal with. And so that's where the brew day aspect really ties in together to make this circular loop even more powerful. From there, let's talk about tracking all substitutions. Now, one of the most important things is we all know that on the fly, you may have to make a change. Maybe you ran out of some sort of hops, right? In this screenshot here, instead of going back into the recipe and changing the base information, the goal instead is, hey, let's actually make those substitutions on the fly. And with that, continue to track each lot number. And more importantly, ask yourself why you had to do a substitution, right? And this becomes super critical because most of us, again, when we're taking data, we may just write down, hey, I substituted Cascade hops and Magnum hops, right? Or back and forth with churro or Pilsen malt, etc. But the real question becomes why? Was it because somebody forgot to order that ingredient and order that malt or hops? Was it because you ran out? Was it because, you know, the mash that day was just not cooperating? When you start understanding why and you start tracking that data, this becomes super powerful for understanding, you know, is this something that's process oriented or is this something that's more ingredient oriented, right? And so those are key aspects of tying together when understanding the whole substitution side of things as well, and the second step of actually brewing and going forwards from there. Next, let's take a look at yeast genealogy. Again, this is a screenshot from Beer 30 where you can actually see how, in terms of my genealogy tree, I can actually visually understand what's happening with my yeast that's pitched, harvested, and really understanding if I were to select a brand and batch, just all the nodes that are tied in together. And the importance of this becomes that this is a way for you to really understand the way your yeast connects on a per batch basis, right? So instead of having this mentality of, hey, let me put this in a spreadsheet and then start, literally graphing out nodes on a piece of paper, think about what happens if a fermentation starts stalling and you want to understand which other batches could be impacted, right? And at that point, if you have these really cool visualizations, you should be able to just run filters and understand here that, hey, I can see that I harvested my Indian brown sugar ale, which is where my cursor's at, and I pitched it into batch 13. And because I know that things were stalling, there's a high likelihood that in Malaysian IPA batch 2, there's going to be something similar, right? And that's that yeast performance insight when it comes to traceability that really helps understand just how things are going when it comes to this linear fashion, and realistically when it comes to this circular fashion as well when it comes to traceability. From there, let's dive in on packaging runs, right? And so this is an example of a packaging log. Again, pretty straightforward. Understanding the canning run, packaging size is 12 ounces, 6 cans per set, 4 sets per case, and really understanding that properly tracking all packaging inventory and cost per item is crucial to understanding your overall cost of goods and even more so traceability. And with this, it also includes tracking losses during your run, right? Like, who here has dropped cannons before? Because I know I have. And at that point, you want to incorporate the losses for the cannons. In this case, hey, I dropped 220 cannons, right? And it becomes an aspect of understanding those costs and incorporating them as part of the packaging run. From there, you want to make sure that you're doing this for bottling, canning, and kegging, and even more so including that as part of mobile canning, right? Because that's just as important with this and understanding, even for mobile canning, how efficient is your canning production mobile company actually being, right? And so those are all ways of understanding on the packaging side. And remember, always include low fills and QC destroyed cases as a part of this, right? Because you want to make sure that everything is being accounted for, that there isn't beer that's just randomly walking off or becoming disappeared. And you want to make sure that you are properly allocating each of those components as part of your packaging log and as part of your overall costs as well. From there, we'll talk about step 3, which is understanding COGS. Now, diving in with this aspect, again, part of our circular loop, step 3 becomes looking at lot traceability, packaging materials, and then putting that together to understand what batch costing really is. Now, a really good way to look at that is having summaries that you do in whatever software or whatever spreadsheet you're using that really breaks things down based on grains, hops, adjuncts, with the actual full history of every lot number and cost that went into that brew, and then diving in further with understanding what is the average dollar value per barrel, per hectoliter, per liter, whatever base unit you're using, and tie that in together to understand, just how things are transpiring forwards on the raw material side, right? And so this becomes a really good way to understand just what's happening for raw material side of things, and the overall costs that go into it for that particular brew, and really understanding what particular lots and vendors things are coming from. From there, similarly on the packaging side, you want to break things down based on bottling, canning, kegging, and really understand the packaging run per cost that happened per batch. And so this becomes really awesome when you start breaking it down on the average per barrel, but then break it down further with an average per bottle, average per can, and average per keg, right? And so this has become super awesome because now you're able to really understand when it comes to your costs, how much is it actually tying in for you, right? And you get to evaluate the breakdown that's happening per run, efficiencies and losses, and from there, just dive in further with understanding, which particular areas of savings could exist, right? Imagine if because of this data, you start looking at comparing alternate options. For example, renting versus owning your kegs, right? And this is only powerful and able to be understood when you start comparing what the average dollar value for keg ends up being when you're looking at the actual, packaging side for these particular different brews that have happened and different packaging runs that are going. With that, you can then take this information and basically put the two aspects together, right? You're able to put together the raw materials, put together the packaging costs, and really understand the true costs that happen per bottle, cans, and kegs. And in this example here from Beer 30, you're able to see that the final yield summary is that my carton of bottles, which is 24 bottles, 12 ounces each, is costing $14.62 to make. my cans are costing me $10.15, and my half barrel kegs are $89, right? And this becomes awesome because you're able to break this down just based on raw materials and packaging supplies into the overall cost for this, telling me that, hey, my overall bottle for raw materials and packaging is 61 cents, a can is 42 cents, and a keg is $89. And you can even break this down further when it comes to kegging, break this down by pints, break this down by like, full pours at the bar, taproom side, and really understand just how those costs are all tying in together. But let's keep in mind, right? This is all tying in with raw materials and packaging, but there's a lot of additional factors that go into cost of goods as well, right? And depending on the brewery, depending on how you're really approaching this, whether you're just doing a ballpark or you're breaking it down per batch, some aspects to think about could include labor. And in particular, looking at labor for brewing, as this diagram kind of shows here for one of our customers, Black Hops, it really breaks it down further as to what's actually happening with their information. And so you can look at labor for brewing, labor for packaging. You may want to include things like overall overhead, right? Whether it's just operational costs, rent, electricity, water usage, etc., to really dive in and understand how that's diving in together as well. From there, the yeast side of things and yeast costs, and this becomes super interesting when you start looking at it, right? Where if you're just doing a fresh pitch into the first batch, all the yeast costs is theoretically going into that first batch. But as you start harvesting and repitching, that yeast cost is technically being spread up over multiple batches. And that really helps understand what the cost of goods are for that particular batch. And at that point, the yeast is dynamically changing, right? So just something to think about as you're calculating costs and really diving in to understand what makes the most sense for your brewery. And also including things like taxes, right? Whether it's excise tax or whether it's, to the TTB, understanding just how that all ties in together. And so like I mentioned, this diagram comes from one of our customers, Black Hops Brewery. Dan Norris, the CEO of that company, actually posted this really cool article on his blog, Top 11 Lessons for Building a Brewery and Navigating the Valley of Death. If anybody's ever interested, feel free to shoot me a message, or you can just Google this as well. Really good research and really good blog articles on thinking about scalability and just diving that all in together for cost of goods as well. From there, let's go into step 4 of this whole traceability loop, which is looking at distribution and sales. And what really ties in here very nicely is looking at weekly sales reports, right? And so this is, again, a screenshot from Beer 30, where you're able to pick a start date and end date. And in this case, I just wanted to look at all my data from Q1, right? And what's really awesome is that I can start breaking down my revenue that's happening across all my different sales sources on a monthly and weekly basis. And from there, what's great is that I can now start associating that with my cost of goods, right? So now we're starting to piece together all of those different data points that are around. How much did it cost me to make this? What are my revenue streams looking like? And then diving that further with comparing by companies and accounts, understanding what are your hot targets, and then even tracking sales rep performance, right? So these have become really cool ways to understand just how your sales reps are doing, just how your accounts and distributors are doing, and really diving in and understanding what's happening in your business on a week-by-week basis, right? It becomes a super awesome way to tie that loop up and just go step by step with that. From there, one of the more powerful things with this data is to break it down one layer further and start comparing different things, like looking at different brands and or packaging types, right? And so with that same data that I just showed you on week to week, I decided to just overlay some filters to start breaking this down based on bottles, cans, kegs, the 15 gallons and 5-gallon kegs. And now I can start seeing just what's happening across each of these different SKUs, right? And so this is showing me some really cool data. And again, this is taken from like Q1 of just some fake data that we have. And it's great because it's showing me that, hey, as COVID has started, around the March timeframe, canning was starting to pick up and kegging was starting to go down. And again, these are all ways to be able to understand visually what's happening when it comes to depletions and trends, right? And taking it a further would be to then use that data to start forecasting future demand. So it becomes a really cool way to tie in that whole sales side of things and distribution when you're using the data properly. From there, let's talk about sales traceability. Now, this is a really cool module. We're actually rolling this out next week as a brand new module in the Beer 30 platform. And the really cool thing about this is that what the mentality really needs to be as people are making sales orders is, depending on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, is that for each sales order, you actually want to incorporate the actual batch number that was put onto that truck, right? And so this becomes a really awesome way to dive in. And this example here, in order to go to SD Tap Room, I have 2 kegs of my Cambodian Snake Venom IPA, 1 keg of my Indian Brown Sugar Ale, and 25 cases of my Moroccan Coconut Stout bottles. And what's really cool about this is that I can now start breaking down and start saying that, hey, there were 16 cases of my batch 3, and I still have 9 more cases that I need to allocate to a particular batch, right? And this becomes super awesome for traceability, where now if you start thinking about the loop, you know exactly what was brewed into batch number 3, what raw materials were used, you know the cost of goods associated with batch number 3, and then from there, you know exactly what location that batch number 3 went to, and I had 16 cartons that went to my SD tap room, right? And so that's really cool because that ends up showing that whole sales traceability side and tying that up together to know exactly where your product is being placed. From there, let's enter the bonus realm of product recalls, right? Product recalls, something that none of us wish ever happens, and if it does, it can be a nightmare if it's not handled properly. And that's where the beauty of something like a batch history aspect comes in when you start looking in this loop of full traceability from start to finish. Where now, if there's ever a product recall that you may have to do, there's really a number of steps that come into the process, right? First step becomes identify the ingredients or processes that led to the issue, right? And that could be something where you have to start understanding all the batches that will be impacted by an ingredient. So what this really means is being able to run a report on your raw materials where I can pick, for example, start of 2020, right? And in this case, I'm looking at Jan 1, 2020 to October 6, 2020. I can then say, hey, let me run a report to identify all brands and batches with this lot number 131229, right? So think of this as an example. Some particular grain vendor said, hey, we over roasted our malts, over roasted our churro. There may be some issues with it. And now at a push of a button, when I type in a lot number, I can see these are all the batches that were impacted, right? One's on April 5th, April 3rd, different numbers of Australian hazy IPAs, Japanese IPAs, Kiwi liquor bases, and now you start diving into understanding just what lot numbers are impacted by this. From there, you can then take it a step further and identify the accounts and locations where those batch numbers were sold. Now, this becomes great because now you're diving in and tracking down field data. And this is great because now I can pick that brand and batch. And in this case, let's just say use that Moroccan Coconut Stout batch 3. And now I know that for this particular batch, brand and batch, I had 2 kegs that went to tap room on April 22nd, 2 kegs that went to them again on April 22nd on a different order, town hall, beer garden, etc. And I can start seeing exactly the full distribution scope of San Diego, Cleveland, and more importantly, when it was delivered, right? And so this becomes great to understand just where those batch numbers went and when they were delivered. And then as part of the product recall step, you've then notified the appropriate parties and customers and then retrieve and either dispose of the product or do whatever else is necessary, right? And so that becomes a way to really approach product recalls, but it's only possible if you've been tracking all this information from start to finish from day one of the brewing process. And the really cool thing about this then, to kind of circle back, is that this then dives in very nicely with revisiting step 1, which is brew planning, right? And so now it comes back into I brewed, I know my cost, I sold it, I know exactly where it went. Hey, let's use that information to rinse and repeat and go back to my brew schedule. Where now I'm looking again at tank utilization, availability of materials and raw materials, work schedules, equipment availability, uncooperative yeast, and again, the product demand and current burn rate, right? So again, with this, now we have gone ahead and literally closed that entire feedback loop, where we've gone from starting, scheduling and task management, all the way into raw materials yeast, batch costing, raw materials and packaging material costing, distribution and sales, batch history, and then again, going in this circular manner. So with that, the key takeaway that I really want people to understand with capturing this data and understanding what comes next is to really focus on using data for lot traceability, cost analysis, sales forecasting, product recall, and future brew planning, right? The 5 steps that really come into this loop that we're looking at for traceability. From there, with this data, you're able to utilize it to brew more beer and brew better beer. With that, if you're interested in learning more, just like Homer Simpson here with the Beer 30 shirt on, you can comment data below. You can also check out Beer 30 at the virtual booth 23. I'll be around later today. Andrew set up some really cool virtual booths. So if anybody has questions, feel free to chime in. Feel free to ask me questions on that as well. Really good information there. You can also send me an email, pk@thefifthingredient.com. Visit our website, thefifthingredient.com. And again, a huge thank you to Andrew and the Craft Beer Professionals community. So yeah, overall, that's the talk on you're capturing all this brewery data, now what? So if anybody has any questions, feel free to add them into the comments, and I'll get through them one at a time from there. Awesome. Well, thank you all for checking this out. There's some really cool new oh, sorry. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so thank you all for checking this out. There's some really cool different sessions happening today. I know Andrew has a happy hour as well. So really looking forward to it. And, thank you all. Have a great day. Bye.